Hello and welcome back everybody to this fifth and final session of our online conference on migrants and systemic resilience. When Bridget, Friedrich and I were planning this conference, we weren't quite sure how the numbers of participants would develop during the day. This is the final session. I'm very pleased to see that we still have large numbers with us. So thank you for staying with us, or welcome if you've just joined us for this session. This fifth session is focusing on migrants and systemic resilience in food and agriculture. And of course, those of you who have followed migration policy developments under COVID, you will know that many farm workers, migrants who work on farms, have been exempted from international travel restrictions in some countries. In some other countries, migrants with irregular status working on farms have been given temporary status. And yet in other countries, governments have been encouraging domestic workers, citizens, to fill shortages that arose on farms and in agriculture, but also in food processing. So migrants play an important role in agriculture and in food production across different countries. The share of migrant varies, but the responses under COVID have also, to some extent, varied across countries. So we're really discussing here, what's the role of migrants in shaping systemic resilience in food production and agriculture? And I'm delighted to welcome our three speakers. I'll introduce them briefly. Philip Martin is Professor Emeritus at the University of California at Davis. Phil wrote a think piece about food supply resilience and migrant workers for MigResHub, and you can find that paper on the website. So Phil will be talking about his paper. I'm also delighted to welcome Cristina Rapone, who is Migration and Employment Specialist at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, and also Letizia Palumbo, who is a research fellow here at the Migration Policy Center of the European University Institute. As always, we'll aim to have presentations and remarks by the two discussants for about 30 to 35 minutes, followed by Q&A. As was the case in the previous sessions, if you want to ask a question, please type it into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, in the Zoom chat box, and direct it to the Migration Policy Center. The questions will be sent to me, and I'll then allocate them after the presentations. So without further ado, let's go ahead. Phil, floor is yours.
Good morning from California, but good afternoon in Europe. This is, we're talking now about what we can say about migrant farm workers in providing a supply primarily of fresh fruits and vegetables in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. And I want to sort of highlight three things initially, and that they're kind of global in scope, and then focus a little more on what happened in North America and particularly the United States. So global agriculture is still the world's #1 employer. Roughly 1/4 of the world's labor force is employed in agriculture. And of that, almost 900 million people employed in agriculture, roughly 40% are hired workers, or they work for wages, and 60% are self-employed and family members of farmers. And agriculture is an 80-20 sector. And what that means is that most farms are small, they're hobby, they're retirement operations, they don't produce very much, they don't hire very many people. The 20% largest farms account for about 80% of the output. And while we never really think about concentration in agriculture in the same way that we think about concentration in brewing, or the world's largest 4 or 5 brewing companies account for a huge share of the world's beer output, it's getting that way in some particular commodities. So if we look at the fresh berry sector, the largest single marketer of berries is a company called Driscoll's, and they're very big in both Europe and the United States. And they might account for as much as 25 to 30% of total fresh berry production. So we've got a big sector. It's mostly self-employed and family, but in industrial countries where we have a small share of workers in agriculture, hired workers do most of the farm work. So if you look at agriculture as a whole, you say most of the work is done by self-employed people and their family members. But if you look at industrial countries, it's actually hired workers who do most of the work. And when we get to the subspecialty of fruit and vegetable and horticultural specialties, things like nurseries, mushrooms, et cetera, hired workers typically do 90% or more of the work, especially in a country like the United States. Those hired workers are vulnerable. Who are they? They're local workers who can't find better jobs, and they're migrants from other countries. In Europe, there's a relatively diverse migrant workforce. A lot of Eastern Europeans, some North Africans, people from other countries. In the United States, it's primarily people born in rural Mexico. And if we take the United States as an example, average employment is about 1.5 million. So you take a snapshot every month, add them up, divide by 12, you get about 1.5 million. But of course, you need more than 1.5 million people to work, because in some seasons, you need more workers, in some seasons fewer. There's a lot of turnover. So we have about 2.5 million people every year who work in US agriculture. They're mostly born in Mexico. About half are unauthorized, but the legal migrant worker has gone up, and now about 10% are what we call H-2A guest workers. In Canada, rural Mexicans are about 1/3 of seasonal crop workers. And one important difference is we have integrated the automobile industry in North America and the agricultural industry in North America. In autos, the cars assembled in Mexico are assembled by Mexican workers, in Canada by Canadian, and in the United States by American workers. In agriculture, it's the same rural Mexican workforce, whether you're in Canada, the United States, or in Mexico. And my little machine, Martin, will not go forward. I'm not sure if I'm locked into not being able to move. There we go. Whoops, it went too far. The second thing, so this is the punchline of today. We had lockdowns to reduce the spread of the virus. Food's essential. There was a very uneven impact. We had employment, for example, in meatpacking actually going up. We had restaurant jobs down. We could not shift labor within the food system very easily. Unemployed people in restaurants really, by and large, did not go out into the fields and pick crops. Why not? They didn't. They needed temporary housing. The employers preferred migrants and guest workers. And so we really didn't see big changes in farm wages and working conditions. We saw a lot more personal protective equipment, a lot more efforts to prevent the spread of COVID. But what COVID did do is, just as we heard in the care sector earlier, is COVID accelerated trends that were already underway. And what are those trends that were already underway? Number one is mechanization. Over and over again, people say machines don't get sick. Mechanization and labor aids to make workers more productive have been spreading fast. Second, actually, we've seen more guest workers. Guest workers can be timed. So the line in the United States is always that guest workers are just in time. US workers are just in case. You hire extra because you don't know if they're going to stay. The guest workers are, the word that is often used is loyal. They have contracts. If they lose their jobs, they have to leave. And the third thing that we'll come back to at the end is imports are going up. So what happened this year with COVID? Well, we know that restaurants closed. And that meant that actually fresh produce sales were down because people made fewer shopping trips. And people bought and consumed more processed foods rather than fresh foods. But shipments of most fresh fruits and vegetables were very similar in 2020 to 2019. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The apple trees are planted, they're going to produce a crop. As long as the price to the farmer covers the cost of harvesting, they're going to be harvested. So when we look across the fruits and vegetables, we see that there really was not a big drop in how much was produced, and therefore the need for labor. But in many cases, the prices received by farmers were lower because a bigger supply with a slightly smaller demand meant prices went down. Who are the workers in the United States? Farm workers are aging. They're roughly half unauthorized. Most are settled, that is, they live in one place. They don't migrate around from one farm to another. If look at the United States, even among the unauthorized, most unauthorized farm workers in the US are parents who have US born and therefore US citizen children. So what did COVID-19 do? Well, it raised the cost of labor, not because of wages going up, but there had to be more purchases of personal protective equipment. There had to be extra provisions for housing in case workers got sick. In many cases, instead of filling buses up, they went half full, and therefore you had to make more trips. Remember, it wasn't all brand new with COVID, because in many cases, for food safety reasons, workers wore masks and gloves just to make sure that food was kept safe. What many farmers did in 2020 was put workers in pods. So much farm work is done by crews. Crews vary in size from 10 to 50 or 60. And so in order to prevent the spread of COVID, in many cases, especially guest workers, were housed together. So the United States hired a little over 200,000 legal guest workers for agriculture last year. Those guest workers were put together in so-called pods of 15 or 20, and the workers lived together, worked together, and the whole idea was that if COVID were to break out, it would be confined to one group rather than spread throughout the entire workforce. And the entire workforce, remember, in some cases is several thousand people. There were efforts to try and protect workers from one another by adding plastic shields, et cetera. But in general, the surprising thing was in some ways how little changed rather than how much changed. So that if you were to look at the farm workers of 2019 and the farm workers of 2020, you would see that they're still rural Mexicans, they're still roughly being paid the same wages, but there were far more masks in 2020 than there were in 2019, more gloves, and more efforts to prevent things from spreading. But we're talking about resilience. What is COVID doing or likely to do to trends that were already underway before COVID broke out? And the big three are more mechanization, more guest workers, and more imports. And to take each in turn, agriculture is a story of labor-saving change. So we know that as countries get richer, the share of people employed in agriculture goes down. And the corollary to that, of course, is that among those still in agriculture, those who are hired by wages or for wages, the share goes up. What has been happening is that there is more effort to try to harness technology and use technology to replace workers. It's not just replace workers. In some cases, it's a matter of also making the workers who are there more productive. And there we go. And a lot of crops that people said could not be harvested mechanically actually are. So what happens with agricultural mechanization is if you are planting new crops, you plant them in order to mechanize them. So the United States has a rapidly expanding olive oil sector. All new olive oil farms are planted to harvest the olives mechanically. In any growing commodity, there's a lot more mechanization than a declining commodity. So for example, most fresh asparagus now in the United States comes from Peru. The shrinking US asparagus farmers would like to mechanize. The market is too small. They will disappear before they mechanize. So a growing industry is best positioned to mechanize. And once again, my little thing won't move forward. Sorry. The second thing is more guest workers. for reasons that I don't understand, my little slideshow here will not advance. And I don't know if that's me or you. One last thing on mechanization. If you look at military robotics, the whole idea is performance, not cost. Spend a lot of money in order to save a soldier. If you look at mechanization and agriculture, it's all about cost, not performance. In nurseries, you have to move a lot of plants. The first effort to move plants mechanically was a $100,000 machine. This is a $25,000 machine. It has to be cheap. It doesn't matter if you get all those apples, but it has to be a cheap machine. The second thing that's happened is more guest workers. The program doubled in size over the last 6 years. It's continuing to increase. It's 94% Mexicans, and we're going to see more guest workers over time. The big issue is that these guest workers cost more per hour than US workers. Why do they cost more per hour? Because the employer has to pay for the recruitment and the transportation, and there's a special adverse effect wage rate that is higher than the minimum wage that has to be paid. But the workers are different. The H-2A workers are young, they are selected for productivity, and the US workers are much more diverse. And you see a lot of cases in which you'll have both older and younger workers, and workers carpool, and therefore in order to get the younger part of the workers in the carpool, you also hire older ones. There's also a labor insurance aspect. If you hire US workers, you don't know if they're going to show up. If you hire H-2A workers, you know they're there. There is getting to be, as the H-2A program expands, there's getting to be resentment. The H-2A workers are young, they're almost all men, they get free housing, and there's no payroll taxes taken out of their wages. The US workers, remember, labor-intensive agriculture is mostly in metro areas. It's in urban areas or urban counties that have very high rents. And if you look at Monterey County, which is the so-called salad bowl of the United States, even if you earned $15 an hour, which is more than the minimum wage, you would still be paying 3/4 of your earnings in rent just for a medium apartment. The final thing that's speeding up is more imports. The United States already imports over half of its fresh fruit and about 1/3 of its fresh vegetables. And of course, Mexico is the source of most of those fruit imports and almost all of the vegetable imports. So we're getting both workers and commodities from Mexico. Mexico is the world's largest tomato exporter. It's the world's largest avocado exporter. The fast growth is in berries. And we're getting exactly what economic theory would predict. There is a certain amount of trade in place of migration. The ex-Mexican President Salinas said in 1990 that Mexico can either export tomatoes or tomato pickers to the United States. And of course, what has happened is Mexico is exporting both. They're exporting fresh tomatoes and they're exporting tomato pickers. So the final slide is, how do you think about the trade-offs for resilience? Mechanization has the attribute that machines don't get sick, but machines are fixed cost and labor is variable cost. So if I buy a $300,000 machine, I have to pay for that, whether there's a crop to be picked or not. There's also the question of whether consumers are going to accept machine harvested produce. And in some cases, yes, and some not. The guest worker option is always this thing: will richer countries run out of workers from poorer countries? And the analogous question is, guest workers, we know, I mean, whether you use the adjective loyal or vulnerable, they have restricted rights when they're abroad. How do you protect them during recruitment, during employment, and during return? With imports, you have trade in place of migration. There's always food safety and security issues. One big question is, what role, if any, should buyers play, supermarket chains play, in trying to help enforce labor compliance in the supply chain? I mean, the final point to leave you with is, food is essential, but which food? If we take my favorite example, we have something, I'm sure it's everywhere, called red raspberries. Now, red raspberries are very nice, they're very expensive, and they're very labor intensive. And in the United States, about half of red raspberries are bought by people who earn over $150,000 a year. Now, should you make immigration exceptions to ensure that people get the red raspberries during a COVID pandemic? We did in 2020. Clearly, it would be bad for the raspberry farmers if they were not admitted. But even if food as a group is essential, will we ever get to the point where we will look at particular foods? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil, for this really interesting presentation that raises a lot of questions that will be discussed, no doubt, later on. I was particularly interested in the comparison of alternative responses, and of course, there's a politics in this as well, which we'll discuss later. Let's move on straight away to Cristina Rapone from FAO.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martin, and also for inviting me, and also to make a few points on the very interesting paper in the presentation we just heard. Very briefly, what I wanted to first highlight, I think, are some key points that have been also raised in the paper, which I think are important to then discuss the policy options. So the first one is that really the COVID-19 pandemic has made visible the contribution of that migrants play in agri-food systems. And this is not only about international migrants, but also about internal migrants. We know that the majority of migrants actually move within their own country, within the region. We have seen that problems in shortages of labor and seasonal laborers were not just a problem, of course, highlighted high in the media, maybe in the US or in Europe, but in many, many other countries like India or across the world. The second point that I think is important to highlight is this role of the seasonal migrants and the seasonality of agriculture. And a very interesting fact has been mentioned about, like, the one side, the declining employment shares in agriculture, and on the other hand, the raising shares of hired labor, at least in certain agricultural subsectors. And the third fact that was highlighted, I think, very important, is the widespread informality and the poor working conditions that make both the agricultural workers very vulnerable, but at the same time also agricultural less attractive for local, even for local unemployed workers and the substitutions. We have seen how during the pandemic made visible the contribution of migrants, but also the vulnerability. You know, that they've been exposed to occupational safety and health hazards. We have seen some major outbreaks among migrant laborers in dormitories or in processing facilities. And I think highlighting these 3 points really is a start for trying to discuss some of the policy options, and I'm here just to, you know, kick off the discussions and present some of those ideas. So we heard about the trade-offs between mechanization, temporary migrant workers, and imports, but I think it's also important to have a broader view, in the sense that, of course, the conditions in high-income countries, very industrialized countries, is very particular, but we also need to make a distinction when we look at policies between the global and the domestic value chains. We need to think that in most of countries, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa or in Southeast Asia, like between 75% and 90% of the food that is produced is actually produced in domestic value chains by micro, small, medium enterprises. So when we look at different food systems, we also need to look at different responses. And the second point that I wanted to highlight is that, yes, we talk about the resilience of agri-food systems, but I think that when we look at resilience, we cannot separate resilience from the dimensions of inclusivity and sustainability. So these 3 dimensions goes hand in hand. We need to really build resilient food systems that are inclusive and sustainable. And when we look at sustainability, this is also some environmental and social concern. And especially when we look at the majority of the labor in agriculture, which is in developing countries, agriculture is the employer and the backbone of the livelihoods of the rural poor. So we cannot transform food systems at the backs of the rural poor. We need to reinsert the rural poor within the paradigm, within the narrative of system transformation. And this inclusivity it's true also for migrants. We will see also afterwards. And the third point is a very interesting point made at the very end by Philip about what food. I think here what food is essential. I think the transformation of food systems need to provide affordable, healthy diets. This is the objective, to leave no one behind. This is the objective of the 2030 agenda. We know that the world is not on track to achieve zero hunger. And I think having the objective of affordable, healthy diets in these environmental sustainability and this inclusivity of not leaving no one behind, it's really the point where we need to have to. And there it comes to where do migrants come into this this course? And I think here we got an opportunity, if we can say so, from COVID-19. So COVID-19 is accelerating, certainly has been said, facts or changes that we're already undergoing, and is also making visible structural challenges that were characteristic of the agricultural sectors. So when it comes to migration and agriculture, I think what's most important that we take this as an opportunity to increase the coherence between labor migration and sectoral policies. We need to look at the needs of agriculture, of the sector, its seasonality, how it's changing, but also in the way of how to maximize the benefits of migration. And because so far the two have been often separated, and sometimes the migration policies do not speak to the agricultural needs. I think in the first phase we have seen a lot of short-term responses in terms of maybe extensions of visas or exemption from mobility restrictions. Now that we move farther, we need to think at the medium long term, and it's true for second. We're all living with a wave of COVID, but it's also building the resilience to future shocks. And if I think about the migration systems, probably we need to facilitate matching platforms between labor demand and labor supply in agri-food systems. This can be also done through more innovative and online also platforms, but really giving all migrants also the possibility to access these opportunities. We have seen in the crisis that it was not only about bringing seasonal migrants into a certain area or country, but also allowing maybe others that who lost their jobs to potentially be filling labor shortages. But I think this flexibility of labor sourcing is important with the dimension of timing. Now we have seen how timing is crucial for agriculture, and so the facilitation on this movement, it's something that needs to be put at the center when we look at migration policies and the resilience of food systems. Can seasonal migration be a tribal win? No, I'm just like putting some questions out also for the discussion. Can we make seasonal migration a tribal win, both for migrants diversifying their income sources, for areas of origin and destination? Again, I'm not talking only international migration, but also internal migration. We know that for many migrants, many seasonal migrants, maybe small-scale farmers, they work on their own farm, and in the slack season they look for other income-generating opportunities, maybe in other rural areas. Can we make this really a triple win, and how to do it? What is the role when we look at international migration, the role of bilateral labor migration agreements, agricultural seasonal migration schemes that needs to be anchored in human rights? So the other pillar needs to be, okay, facilitating the movement, flexibility in labor sourcing and timing, but also the improvement of the working conditions, improving the safety of workers, the skilling of agricultural workers. Who are those agricultural workers? Which background do they have? Do they come from agriculture? Can we have a sharing of knowledge between those experiences? And finally, very, very important, has been highlighted by the pandemic, is the importance of working conditions. I know we'll talk about later also of that dimensions, but improving occupational safety of health. Agriculture is the most dangerous, one of the most dangerous sector. In this particular case, access to protective equipment, water and sanitation, the living and working conditions of seasonal and general migrant workers in the sector, I think needs to be put at the center. So when we look at really at the broader issues of how to build the resilience of food systems, I think it's not only about the production. We need to look at the entire value chains. We need to look at the different food systems, more traditional, modern, alternative food systems that have maybe more social and environmental sustainability goals at its heart, and how all of this impacts on food security and in all its dimension.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Cristina. And of course, a lot of people, we've been arguing for having more coherence, as you say. And I mean, one question one could raise is whether this concern with systemic resilience might actually lead some people to think more proactively about how to link migration debates to these larger debates about some of these essential sectors: food, social care, health services. So I think there's hope that the kinds of discussions we're having here about making these linkages might actually also spill out into public debates and into policy debates. Thank you, Cristina. And we'll move on to Letizia.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. I would like to thank you, Martin, and the other organizer of this important event. Thank you very much. And thank you, Phil Martin, for his brilliant presentation, which has disclosed some very important and crucial aspects concerning the agri-food system and migrant workers and systemic resilience in this sector. In these 5 minutes that I have, I would like to focus on some key issues that came out during his presentation, and that highlights some key challenges concerning the link between systemic resilience in the agri-food sector, sustainability in terms of labor and environmental standards, and the protection of fundamental rights, in particular labor rights. So the first point, the first issues concern supply chain dynamics and value chain dynamics. So as Phil Martin said in his presentation, the agri-food systems rely on the employment of a just-in-time, flexible migrant labor force, which is characterized by low wages and exploitative working conditions. So one of the main factors driving the recourse to this labor force is price-cost squeeze and the imbalance of power along supply chain. So in this context, the margin for medium and small farmers to increase prices on wholesale markets is very limited. And the COVID crisis has made visible these dynamics, has made visible the limits of local supply chains in terms of price distortions, unfair competition, distribution dynamics. So in the light of this, I really think that one of the main challenges concerning systemic resilience in the agricultural sector that needs to be addressed by governments and supranational institutions, including European institutions, is that of supporting sustainable agri-food system through the adoption of intervention and measures allowing farmers, in particular small farmers, to strengthen their bargaining power and to obtain fair prices for their products. So that means, for instance, to support small farmers, medium farmers as well, organization and cooperation. This is something that really needs to be considered. So, and this is the second point I want to address. Can technologies help in this regard? What's the role of technologies in this regard? And my answer is yes and no. So on the one hand, as Philip Martin has highlighted, technologies may provide significant opportunities to farmers and producers. On the other hand, there are also several risks and points that need to be taken into account. And here I would like to address some of these, especially in terms of implication in terms of labor exploitation. The first issue concerns the access to technologies. So as Phil Martin highlighted in his presentation and in his paper, access to technologies is not available to all farms, especially to small and medium-sized farms. So from this perspective, the use of technology may reflect and foster forms of imbalance of power within the agri-food system and lead to, for instance, the disappearance of small farmers. At the same time, we need to consider the impact of technology on the environment and on labor condition. There are some studies, for instance, a recent study on the use of agricultural technologies in the rural areas in the Netherlands that highlight that the impact of mechanization on labor conditions is ambiguous in terms of working condition and workers' incomes. So this is something that we also have to consider. In addition, and here I want to be a bit provocative, it's also necessary to consider the impact of mechanization and technologies on labor migration and employment of migrant labor in general. That's a big question. So what happens if migrant workers are mainly replaced by machines? In which sector could these workers find another place in the labor market of the country of destination, considering the strong labor market segmentation on the basis of nationality, class, gender that characterize many, I would say most, of the countries of destination? I mean, as I say, it's a provocative question, but it's also to say that there is the risk that the replacement of migrant workers by machine may create or increase new segments of marginalities and vulnerability exposed to exploitation, including in other sectors. Moreover, and this is another issue that is related to this, is the impact that the replacement of migrant labor by agricultural technologies may have in terms of fostering a process of depopulation of rural areas. And this is especially true if we consider that migrant workers in some countries, such as Italy, have played a crucial role in countering rural exodus and demographic decline in rural areas. Then, and this is the last point that I want to touch, which is really connected to what Cristina Rapone was saying. It is connected to working condition working and living condition in the agri-food system. And what I want to stress here is that interventions concerning systemic resilience in the agri-food system that are aimed at supporting sustainable agri-food system should definitely include strengthening wages and labor rights, bolstering welfare service for workers, pay specific attention in this regard to gender dimension and to the issue of social reproduction, which is another big issue that needs to be considered when we look at the labor rights of farm workers. And also, it's also important to consider the adoption of measures aimed to address labor cost strategies through the use of subcontracting system and practices, which is another way to foster unfair competition and social dumping in this sector. Of course, as also Cristina was saying, labor migration policies here would play also a crucial role, and I really think that it's necessary to rethink and change current system of seasonal, temporary and circular migration that so far have mainly fostered conditional vulnerability for seasonal workers and facilitate situations of exploitation. But this is not the only field. The other field, I think, is also the role that agricultural policies can play in this regard. And I think that, for instance, making funding for farmers conditional on respect for labor and environmental standards is something that needs to be considered. And in this regard, the new system adopted by the Common Agricultural Policies, providing for social conditionality in their fundings, is something important to be considered. And last point is related to what Phil Martin was saying in his paper and also highlighted in his presentation. So we know that one of the risks when we consider raising and increasing wages and improving labor rights condition is that this can lead to the disappearance of some small farms, right, that are not able to stay in the market. However, I believe that these challenges and risks should be addressed, as I say at the beginning, by addressing the imbalance of power in supply chains and by supporting small and farmers and producers to increase their power in the long supply chains. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Letizia, for again raising a number of issues I think that are highly relevant and to some extent also complementary to what was said before. We've got about half an hour for questions and answers, and as always, if you have a question, please write it into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. If possible, please let us know who the question is for. And when you write your question, please don't send it to everybody, but to the Migration Policy Center. That way I will see the questions and I'm forwarding them to the speakers. So I suggest we kind of start with one round, the first round of questions where we'll give one question for each of the speakers. The first question for Phil, I mean, you went through the various responses and developments. You talked about more mechanization, more guest workers, more imports. And you said to some extent, we've been seeing that happening for some time. And you said that some of these developments are speeding up now because of COVID. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the political debates and some of the politics and some of the interests in this, because of course, these choices are not simply kind of technocratic choices or very efficient choices. There's costs and benefits for different sides. Now, in the specific context of the US, for example, what have been the interests here? Have farmers themselves been thinking strategically? Are they thinking ahead? Are they thinking that one particular type of response is best? Is there any evidence of kind of government thinking strategically on some of these issues? So what are the kind of costs and benefits, and what are some of the politics of this? For Cristina, one of the issues you mentioned was the relationship between resilience, what you called inclusivity, and sustainability. Now, of course, we do know that currently, and this question to some extent is for Letizia as well. Letizia has done a lot of work on exploitations of migrants in European agriculture. We know that many migrants work under considerably restricted rights in agriculture. And one of the restrictions that people often talk about is the restriction of employment to the agriculture sector, often the restriction to one particular employer only. And of course, in my experience, talking to farmers, farmers often have this demand for a workforce that is basically almost tied to them, to make sure that they basically stay on the fields during the harvesting period, as one farmer put it to me. So in a way, you could say you have this very restricted and precarious employment conditions that to some extent facilitate, you could argue, facilitate the continuation of production if there's a shortage of workers, if there's not enough domestic workers who want to do those jobs. How do you see some of those restrictions of migrants' rights relating to some of the debates about resilience? And Letizia, maybe more broadly, again, as I said before, you've done work on exploitation of migrants in Italian agriculture, but also European agriculture. What developments have you seen around those issues since the outbreak of COVID-19? I mean, I know that various governments have been making efforts to regularize workers temporarily, but in practice, is there any evidence that employment conditions have deteriorated? Have they improved? What's the evidence on this so far? Okay, let's start with Phil and the politics of these different choices.
Well, thank you, and thank Cristina and Letizia as well for their comments. Agriculture is a complicated industry. Think about it. There's agricultural policies, there's trade policies, there's migration policies, there's tax policies. Each of those sets of policies, which we have in all countries, affects not just farmers, but also farm workers. In general, ag policy in rich countries keeps the sector bigger than it otherwise would be, in part to protect those small and medium-sized farmers. So the general rule is, if you're in a rich country and you don't have many farmers, then public policy subsidizes farmers, and the farmers are richer on average than non-farm residents. And I think that's true in Europe, and it's true in the United States. If we're in a poor country where half the people are farmers, then government policy taxes those farmers, and farmers are poorer than urban residents. Governments want to keep the food cheap in the city. So we have this paradox that in rich countries where there aren't many farmers, they get subsidized and they're rich. If you look at especially the value of their land, not all of them are rich, but on average. And that keeps the sector bigger. We have a trade policy, which often doesn't make it as easy as it could to bring in imports. We have migration policies that make exceptions to bring in migrant workers. And of course, as you probably know, one of the big reasons pension funds and lots of investors own an awful lot of vineyard land in California is because there are great tax advantages to investing in agriculture as opposed to some other things. So in looking at where this system is going, remember it's being pushed in contradictory directions. And we know that 10 years from now, at least in a country like the United States, and I assume in most of Western Europe, there will be fewer and larger farms, more dependent on hired workers than they are today, using more technology than they are using today, and probably imports of fruit and vegetable commodities will also rise. In getting there, in moving from here to the way things might be in 2030, there will be a whole lot of debates, some of which were already mentioned. What, if anything, should be done? I mean, in the United States this year, 40% of farm income is coming from government payments, both due to COVID, but also due to the war with China. In Europe, it's already at a similar level. In Japan and Korea, 55, 60% of farm income comes from government support. So as the importance of government support for the sector increases, what conditionality do you put on it? Do you have an environmental conditionality? Do you have a labor conditionality? And how well will that work in practice? We haven't really tried it. We have a new USMCA to replace NAFTA. For the first time, it allows private suits to say those Mexican strawberries were picked with child labor, exploited labor, and you can try to stop the import of those berries. All of a sudden, we've had a huge interest in the United States in labor conditions in Mexican agriculture. Not necessarily because people are really caring about the conditions of workers in Mexican agriculture, but to try to prevent the import of competing product. And if, I suspect that kind of thing will move forward. The hardest thing to answer about whose interest to serve is that as we move into more technology, it becomes more important to be really good at finance than it is to be a really good farmer. I mean, if you think about, Harvard University has invested something approaching $500 million in California vineyards, California fruits and nuts. They're trying to make money. It becomes almost more important when we plant apple trees or almond trees. There's not going to be any production for 4 or 5 years. And that's a huge amount of money, $20,000 or $30,000 an acre. So upwards of $100,000 a hectare to do the planting, wait 3 or 4 years for a crop. If you can get the money a little cheaper, that's going to make you a far more profitable farmer than if you are exactly good about environmental sustainability and the right fertilizer and all that sort of stuff. If you can save a 0.5% on a $100 million investment just in the financing part, you can have lower yields and still be far ahead of the next farmer. And I think that's, in a sense, as we move toward more technology, traditional farming skills, I mean, people still want to have a good farm manager, a good farmer who knows what to do, and farm workers who are there and can harvest the crops. But as I've looked at the evolution of the system, it's not necessarily the skills that people want in a large farming enterprise often have to do with things we wouldn't necessarily associate with farming. How do I get finance cheaper? How do I do marketing and get a slightly higher price? How do I put a brand name on my little tomatoes that might let me have an end of aisle display in the supermarket? So we're moving, this agricultural system is moving at a whole lot of different speeds. There are the ones who are sending truckloads to the big supermarkets, and there's the farmer just hanging on with a migrant worker in a rural area that's being depopulated. I mean, it's a whole lot of different speeds all at once. And that's what makes it so hard to talk about the agricultural system. There's many subsystems within agriculture, and they're moving at different speeds in different directions. I think overall, I guess the point that I was trying to make is that in meat packing, so the big sector where COVID broke out and made it clear and made clearer to many people what conditions are like was probably meat packing. These are huge plants, they're cold and wet, and we had big outbreaks. Europe had big outbreaks. There were efforts to try to space workers out, but I think the US industry and perhaps some other industries are sort of saying, going forward, we have to do more mechanization. I mean, remember the meatpacking labor force, at least in the United States, is mostly legal, a lot of refugees and stuff. The agricultural system the farming system was much more, let's make it through 2020. But as I said, as people look ahead, they're looking at the more mechanization. The idea of the guest worker is that if you hire local workers, you hear this over and over again, you hire 10 local workers, 5 will show up and 2 will last the season. So you hire extra workers just in case some people don't show. If you hire migrant workers, precisely because they have contracts and the word they use is usually loyal, you know they're going to come and you can actually pay them more per hour because they're selected to be very productive workers. They come just in time and you send them back when the work is done. And I think we'll see more of that as well. So we're in a system whereby the largest farms that produce most of the farm output are thinking about how they become more resilient, and they're doing it primarily in the form of more technology, more guest workers, and many of them, I should add, are also producing in other countries. So the big new thing in the Western Hemisphere is moving into Peru, where there has been a huge explosion of producing fresh fruits, especially to export to other countries. So it gets to be relatively big enterprises that, unlike the stereotypical small farmer, these are enterprises that are thinking of revenues and $100 million and up. And it's to have one agricultural policy that tries to encompass someone with a small dairy of 20 or 30 cows, and then someone else who's running, our largest dairies have 30,000 or 40,000 cows. Sure, they're both dairy farms, but they're totally different enterprises. Okay. And the idea of coming up with one policy that's going to be fair, as it were, to both, that's a very, very hard thing to do.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Cristina?
Yes, sir. No, very briefly, I think, I mean, Phil just already mentioned some of the things, that we have been highlighted throughout the day today, which is we have a lot of different food systems, and it's certainly one thing that we need to start with. There is not one size fits all, and we need to look at the different conditions also in the different countries. Again, as I was saying also in my initial remarks. And to me, these issues that you, Martin, asked me about resilience, inclusivity, and sustainability, that really go hand in hand. This is where we need to look at, because one without the others, it won't make the change. It won't build back better. It won't achieve the sustainable development goals. And this inclusivity, it's increasing access also to markets, to opportunities, to assets for small scale farmers, as also Letizia was saying, empowering people, having a close attention to gender, to age issues. What are the future of youth in agriculture? What's the role of the new technologies that they can play? What are the role of women? How to ensure decent work conditions and better living and working conditions for migrants and people employed in agriculture? What is the environment, the link to climate change, environmental shocks, and environmental sustainability, how those play together? And of course, in different contexts, this will mean different also policies put in place. But I think that we really need to think with these three pillars in mind. And you asked me about some of course, we know that a lot of migrants working in agriculture have been employed in informal, casual arrangements without rights, without access to social protection, to health services, to restricted rights, as you pointed out, in terms of changing also employers. During COVID, there are some flexibility in certain countries that have been allowing also people to change employers for those who were, for instance, workers who could not return back to their areas of origin, the possibility of extending visa, but also changing this rule of one fixed employer. But I think we need to really look at it in the different conditions that are in the different settings. It's certainly improving the living conditions and working rights. It's at the backbones, empowering people, and it's also crucial, I think, when when it comes to thinking about the transformation also of food systems. And of course, we know that some of the workforce will probably pull out of agriculture. So when we look at the transformation of food systems, we need to at the same time look at the transformation of rural areas and how those speak to each other, where to create, for instance, jobs for an increasing youth population we have in certain areas like sub-Saharan Africa, youth dividend. What are the possibilities that agriculture can bring into new forms of business, more local food production, more access to new technologies, and again, how the movement of people play into that in terms of income diversification, in terms of seasonality, and how people can diversify income sources by having more activities, and how these two plays together. So not only having the big pictures of large farms, mechanized, of course, in the high income countries, but the reality of the small farms in a lot of the regions of the world, and how these can be viewed in a way of transforming rural areas, transforming agriculture and food system towards more inclusivity and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristina. Letizia?
Can you hear me? Okay. So very briefly. Thank you. Thank you for your question, Martin. In relation to the evidence of national responses to the COVID crisis and labor shortages in the agri-food system, as we know, and as we already said, national governments have adopted several short-term measures to facilitate mobility and the recruitment of seasonal migrant workers and address their condition of vulnerability. One of the main famous scheme in measure in this regard has been the regularization schemes adopted by the Italian government, which, I mean, if we consider that in relation to the general restrictive, national restrictive approach to migration, it's a sort of important and significant step forward, but this regularization contained many shortcomings and limits and had a very limited impact in terms of employment of migrant farm workers, while its impact has been bigger in the domestic work sector. I can't go into detail here, but I just want to highlight this point. And just to say also that is also connected to the fact that in the agri-food system in Italy, we have many asylum seekers, many refugees and undocumented migrants, and they are in a very precarious situation. And these regularization schemes has been not really able to cover and to address these forms of vulnerabilities. So what I could say, and this is related to the findings of a recent research that I did on the working condition in the agri-food system in South and North Europe, is that the impact of these short-term measures adopted by national governments has been quite limited in terms of addressing working conditions in labor-intensive sectors such as agri-food, and also to, in general, address and to prevent forms of exploitation of migrant workers. And I want to say also important thing that is really related to what we were saying about supply chain dynamics and value chain dynamics, is that the fact it can be interesting to note that in Europe, most of the national responses to COVID have been mainly aimed to address shortages of labor and food, and little attention has been paid so far to supporting and developing more sustainable agri-food systems. Indeed, most national initiatives, what I have analyzed, seems to have focused on supporting large retailers, the agri-food industry and logistic platforms, rather than think about how to support small producers, farmers, etc., etc. So this is, I think, another point that needs to be considered.
Thank you, Letizia. It's late in the day. Here in Italy, at least, with 10 minutes left, and we now have quite a few questions that have come in. The reasons I started asking the question was because 20 minutes ago, there were not many questions, but now quite a few. So we'll do one more round, and I'll read out a few questions. And if you could, each of you then take a brief time to address some of them. The first one is Phil. Roxana Babulescu is asking about the relationship between unemployment and seasonal workers. So is there a threshold? Those are not her words, but what if does it make a difference whether unemployment is 5% or 30%, whether or not kind of the supply of seasonal agricultural workers goes up significantly or not? Or is it really the case that this is not going to be a big solution? There's not going to be a big increase in domestic supply. Also a question for Phil, briefly, which are the crops that are most clearly undergoing rapid mechanization, and to what extent is this commercially viable, or is it supported by subsidies, so by research funds from foundations or by governments? Question for Letizia. Do you expect the next common agricultural policy changes in Europe, will that change anything for migrant workers in the EU? Will it have an impact on migrant workers' rights? And if you could comment on this idea of making migrant workers' rights as part of the funding policies, the funding for farmers. A question for Cristina from Friedrich Pöschel. Do you see evidence that COVID-19 will lead to more local food production, so shorter supply chains, which might potentially raise the demand for agricultural workers? And maybe also for Cristina, and maybe also for Letizia, how do you evaluate this idea of mandatory due diligence approaches to improve workers' rights within supply chains internationally? And do you see any problems for farmers with that idea? Okay, quite a few questions. We don't have much time. If you could each take maybe 3 minutes or so in addressing some of these questions. Phil, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. Really briefly, agriculture is a paradoxical industry. Farmers are often 4th, 5th, 6th generation to farm. Farm workers are typically 1st generation. No one dreams of growing up to be a seasonal farm worker. It's a job, it's not a career. You do it until you can find something better. I think what COVID showed is that there are economics works. If unemployment is 15% rather than 5%, there will be a few more people doing seasonal farm work, but it's a few, not a lot. The prospect of getting people who have left agriculture to move back into, remember what I'm saying, seasonal farm work, a job where you're going to work for part of the year. And as everybody has emphasized, you may earn relatively high hourly wages. You won't get many benefits. There are some hazards involved with the job. I don't see us developing in the richer countries as it were, native-born local workforce going forward. I think it's going to be machines and migrants buffered by sometimes by imports. The mechanization, we could spend days talking about mechanization in agriculture. There are 3 or 4 considerations here. I mean, we're doing a big project on this, but one of the things to keep in mind is the size of the market is often very small, and that reduces the interest of manufacturers to make a machine. So why do we have lots of different kinds of tractors? And every year the tractors have new devices on them with GPS and everything else, but we don't have a machine to harvest asparagus. Why? Because the market is very small. You might love asparagus, but there really aren't that many people, there aren't that many acres of it. We just did a little calculation that for melons, So melons are nice, cantaloupes and muskmellows, water, they're nice things to have. They're a summer fruit. But even if you developed a machine that worked, and they're hard, it's hard to harvest them by machine without bruising or cutting them or something. Even if you could develop a machine that would work, you would sell at most 50 of those machines in the United States, 50. Now, given the technological challenges involved in making a machine, making the plant so that everything ripens all at once, making the machine to pick it up and not damage it, in the end, you're going to sell 50. So if they sell for, right now, the prototypes are selling for $200,000 or $300,000 a piece. So you're going to develop the machine, you're going to sell it, you're going to have 100% profit margin. You're still not going to become Bill Gates. And so when you talk to people in these relatively small crops, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is that many of the things that we think about with agriculture, the markets can be relatively small. So we can talk a lot about mechanization, but one of the things I want to leave you with is the size of the market in many cases is not as big as what you might think it is. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Phil. Cristina.
Yes, also a lot to say here, but two observations that I wanted to make that I don't know if that came forward also before. We sometimes, and of course, a lot of the workers and the seasonal workers that work in agriculture are low-skilled workers. But also, what is the future of agriculture in the sense of, in terms of skilling of the workforce? Are we only talking about like a sector of last resort, or are we also professionalizing, sort of saying, agriculture? So I think that's also new technologies and new trends highlights also the needs for skills to be developed specifically for agriculture. So agriculture that needs to be seen also as a business, new opportunities opening up also for young people in terms of new technology be adopted, but also skills to be built in terms of specific subsectors or crops. And I think this is linked then the seasonality of some of this work. So I agree that if it's seen as an employment of last resort, you will never revert back, let's say, the trend of being people employed. Unemployed people will go back to agriculture, but can we build an agricultural workforce that is skilled, that it's empowered, that has a certain, can earn certain wages and rights? And in this is discussions around, for instance, seasonal schemes, circular schemes of maybe agricultural workers that move between locations, between employers, between areas or countries in different ways, but bring skills and bring back expertise and skills. So I think that in terms of developing an agricultural workforce, we need to have the debate into how can we really make a virtuous cycle that starts not just regarding agriculture as a last resort and then suddenly as an essential, let's say, sector when it comes to this is the food we eat. No, so we need to give back the importance to the agricultural sectors because it's the food we need, is our planet, it's the caring of natural resources, and also need certain skills also to go let's say to follow certain also development partners also in terms of new technologies and mechanization and so on. And then I think that, yes, COVID might have improved also the or increase the need also of local production, at least shorting this supply chains. I think there has been in many countries this need, although there has been a lot of push also for not stopping trades, for making, like food commodities flow between between countries, but I think that at least for certain segments of the food systems, more locally produced, more environmentally sustainable, more inclusive food systems are part of the answer, and needs and policies need to focus on this. On these aspects.
Thank you, Cristina. Letizia.
Okay, very briefly, in 1 second, just about the CAP. Yeah, as I said, I mean, I've been with my work, and also in particular with the work that I did for Open Society Foundation. We have been pushing for social conditionality since 2017, and for us was something that it was almost impossible to be adopted, because we know that for member states that was a big problem. And so the fact that now the system has been adopted is certainly a significant step forward for the rights of farm workers. Of course, that we have to see how this is going to be implemented at national level. So there's going to be a problem of implementation and enforcement, also considering, I mean, that all the management of fundings, in particular European fundings, if I think about the Italian context, is a very delicate issue. So that are also quite exposed to the risk of corruption, etc., especially in the agri-food system. So of course we have to see what's going to be the implementation of this, but I think that it's a really important step forward, because before that, labor rights were totally overlooked by the CAP. The other issue that needs to be also highlighted is that the current CAP reform has been totally unable to address climate change, environmental issues. And this is really a big problem that now needs to be addressed, because it's still a big gap in the CAP reform.
All right, well, thank you very much. We've come to the end of this session. Let me thank our 3 speakers, Philip, Cristina, and Letizia, for a really interesting session. We've also come, excuse me, to the end of the conference. I'm wondering if I can, Friedrich, I see him already. I'm not sure if Bridget could come back as well, the 3 co-organizers of this conference. We've had 5 sessions, and as I said at the beginning, we weren't quite sure how this would go. It's a long day, but I think we started with over 120 people, and I'm pleased to see that we still have just over 50. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to thank all the speakers again. Again, a big thank you to Kira and Giovanni at the Migration Policy Center, who have made this conference possible. I'd like to encourage everybody who's still here, to encourage all of you to take a look at our website, to take a look at the various think pieces and commentaries that are already up there. And we will receive 10, 15 more pieces over the next few weeks and months. If you want to contribute, we would very much appreciate that. We are encouraging commentaries. We're looking for commentaries of around about 1,000 words on one of the themes of the overall project. And as Bridget said, we want to grow the network. We want to encourage debate, and we also want to start thinking seriously about collaborative research projects that have a strong research component, obviously, but also aimed explicitly at informing policy debates. Bridget and Friedrich, I don't know if you want to add anything to my final words. Okay, you need to be.
Thanks. No, thanks, Martin. Yeah, just to reiterate the thanks, but also to say, if you could please complete the evaluation forms, that would be really helpful for us. So yes, please do that. Thanks.
Thank you. Friedrich, any last words?
Yeah, perhaps just one sentence in the sense that the interest today and the discussions today have shown that I mean, we are not making this up. There is a topic here, and there is a need for rethinking labor migration in the sense of academic research, but also in the sense of policies. And I hope that there will be lots of exciting work coming out on this in the next month, but hopefully even longer. Please do let us know about whatever you're doing in this respect. We're happy to cite your work and sort of disseminate it further.
Okay, well, thank you very much again to everybody. Please do stay in touch, get in touch if you want to work with us, if you want to contribute to the debate. All the best, and have a nice evening or a nice day. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.